apologize in advance. I'm going to be kind of back and forth, bringing in stragglers. But I do want to just thank you all for your patience as we've been working through some technical issues today. Thankfully, the recorded version, no one's going to know anything. Or at least that's what I'm telling myself. So from here on out, we're going to kind of slide right into the programming that we had intended. Thank you again, Cole, for making this happen for us. But I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Judy to introduce our speakers and our first session, and we'll get going.
Thank you, Patrick. Hi, I am Judy Schwartz. I am coming to you from Bennington, Vermont in the USA. And we've got 2 sessions on facilitating ecosystem restoration from the ground up. The intent is to delve into the opportunities presented by new and emerging networks, as well as the challenges from a standpoint of culture, geography, and technology. How do we harness knowledge and data, tools, and resources? How do we build alliances in a way that embraces the diversity of projects and knowledge systems? Let's ground ourselves first with the question, why eco-restoration? What has been missing from the climate conversation so far is the importance of healthy ecosystems in climate regulation. We know that we can restore even extensive damaged ecosystems, and so we can bring back at least some of that regulation capacity, as well as support lives and livelihoods throughout the world. This is where we have tremendous agency. We are seeing the advent of alliances in service to ecosystem restoration. Let's explore this new landscape of coalitions, what it means, and where to go from here. Our 3 panelists will offer some insight. John Schull in upstate New York is a biological psychologist and entrepreneur and founder of eNABLE, an online community that makes open source 3D printed prosthetics. Having turned his attention to the climate crisis, he co-founded a coalition of scientists, activists, and practitioners called the Eco Restoration Alliance. Emmanuelle Beringer in the south of France leads on sustainable forest management for the Rainforest Alliance. Her focus is on community forests and the relationships and communication that allow them to regenerate, rewild, and flourish. Dennis Garrity is a systems agronomist and widely published researcher based in Nairobi, who has served many global entities, including World Agroforestry and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. He is board chair of the Global Evergreening Alliance, which strives to restore millions of hectares of degraded land throughout the world. So I am going to start tossing questions your way. I will ask each of you to introduce the alliance you represent and how this network employs a community-based approach to empower people on the ground. So I will begin in the order this round that I introduced you. So we will start with John. Oh, John, you need to unmute.
Okay. And I will address question number 1, not questions 1 through 4, right?
Correct.
So I'm going to introduce the Alliance. The Eco Restoration Alliance is less than a year old, but it does represent a really nice sampling of people who've restored collectively already about 1 million acres of land around the world, probably 25 to 50% more since our last tally, using a variety of techniques, all informed by the insight that healthy ecosystems not only feed people and cool their local environments, but also collectively could lower temperatures globally within 10 years. It is a quick fix to a long-term problem, the long-term solution of which is carbon. That, I would say, is sort of the unifying insight for the Eco Restoration Alliance. And in addition to the practitioners we have storytellers and writers and filmmakers like Judith Schwartz, our moderator, and John Liu, and numerous other people who have got their finger on the pulse of the media, as well as a number of people trying to develop an infrastructure for collaboration among alliance members and with other alliances. We are also all convinced that all of this is for naught unless we actually get more people on the ground doing the important work. Our superpower potentially is that we believe that if almost everyone, almost everywhere did the important work on the ground, we would solve this global problem. Our current puzzle, to stick with the superpower metaphor, is how do you run this thing? How do you actually sleep tall buildings with a single bound? That's my introduction.
Excellent, thank you. You're leaving us with a question. It's kind of dangling there. Okay, Emmanuel, I'd love to hear how about your alliance and how your network employs a community-based approach to empower people on the ground.
Thank you, Judith. Hello, everybody, those online and those that will watch this recording. So I work for the Rainforest Alliance, and we work since decades now with farmers and forest communities to sustain their livelihoods and while maintaining or improving the natural environment. So I think everybody knows the RA seal, the frog, on agroforestry products such like coffee or cocoa. But today we want to speak more about the work we do in the forest itself with the forest communities that harvest timber and non-timber forest products. And what we do is that we bring together these communities with funders, local NGO scientists, companies, governments, to really make sure that they have the rights to access the forest, manage the forest, that they have the skills, the knowledge, the capacity support to manage the forest well, and also that they have the investment and the funding that enables them to transform the products and really get benefits and improve their livelihoods. And what we have seen after 20 years working in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala and also in Mexico is that it works. I mean, there's less fires, there's almost zero deforestation. Actually, it's now even growing because we're working on restoration in this area compared to the buffer zone or even the protected areas that are around that area. So communities, if they are given the rights, if they're supported, actually, not only they protect the forest, but let's all restore it. And what we do is we do a productive restoration, that is restoration that is both ecological and economical for them.
Thank you. It sounds like you have a lot to teach us since you've been actively doing this work and with such positive results. Where can we all find more about what you do, about these successful projects?
Oh, okay. Well, we have actually done a learning inventory on our last 15, 20 years in those countries. And we have published our lessons learned and also what we call the integrated community forest management approach. And I think I put the link in the Togo space, but I can definitely put it again here in the chat after I've presented this. And so we have kind of formalized the main ideas and the different steps that are needed. But of course, this is not like a strict methodology. Everything needs to be tailored to context, and more importantly, it needs to be done in a participatory approach. But I will paste the links now.
Excellent, because we're talking about how we can all learn from each other. So we have the communities on the ground, and we have the community of people engaging in networks to support communities in different places, different contexts. Excellent. So Dennis, we will turn to you now. And you've been involved in and with, and perhaps still are, various communities. So I'd love to hear what you're doing, how you're supporting people on the ground, and how you're learning from people on the ground. And I guess we'll start with the Global Evergreening Alliance, but you can certainly branch off from there.
Okay. Well, Judy, first of all, what a pleasure to be having you as our panel facilitator with the wonderful book that you wrote on restoration experiences, which was really inspiring, and all of your good work in this area. Really, really terrific. The Global Evergreening Alliance is a coalition of predominantly large, medium, and small NGOs who are working on restoration programs around the world. And when we first conceived of the value of bringing together so many NGOs with support research organizations, we were concerned about this issue of massive scaling, how the many programs that are being conducted by our members, including programs from each of our conservation organizations and our development organizations, how we could synergize the capacity of all of these organizations into something that would congeal into the ability to implement quite massive programs. And one of the first things that we did as we developed the Alliance and began to know each other and understand our various strengths and weaknesses and how we could support each other in developing large programs was to imagine a really ambitious goal for restoration. I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, that you need a quantitative target in terms of restoration in order to be able to lift the game so that we understand the sheer magnitude of the problem, the sheer magnitude of the solutions that we need to achieve. And so we did major analyses with much of the published work that has come out recently on the restoration potential in agricultural areas that are degraded, in degraded forest lands, degraded grazing lands around the world. And when we added it all up, we found that we could aspire to drawing down 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere annually by 2050, by mid-century, which of course is the same time frame for the Race to Zero, which deals with emissions reductions. And so with that, which was an aggregation of a number of different targets for the scaling up, for example, of agroforestry in agricultural land around the world, which is happening rapidly now, and we want to accelerate that by a factor of 3. Accelerating the adoption of conservation agricultural practices, which involve zero tillage, et cetera, and improving soil carbon in that way. And then in forest lands, adopting more scalable and cheaper practices, such as assisted natural regeneration in community forest lands. And in grazing lands, adopting rotational grazing practices, mob grazing, intensive grazing with long rest periods, and also integrating more trees and silvopastoral systems. So when we added these all up, we came up with this ambitious target, and we now have a whole series of action groups working on disaggregating that to the regional and national and local levels, and moving that forward. This is the campaign for evergreening the earth. But the alliance itself, which is composed of 71 members, is also aspiring to build models of truly massive restoration on the ground, the implementation with communities on the ground in many, many countries. And we started doing this work a number of years ago in the Sahelian region over many countries, and now have extended it to a large program in Eastern and Southern Africa, 6 countries, with major investment from the carbon credits sector, corporate sector. And now we can foresee, with the dedication or the commitment of corporations, the opportunities to actually deploy carbon credits for restoration on a large scale. And so in that particular program I mentioned in East Africa, we're working on 2 million hectares of land across 6 countries. So this is the process of building capacity amongst many organizations to scale our work up to the national, regional, and global levels. And it all depends on the incentives that local people have to produce trees and other practices that benefit them. And so these programs I'm talking about are programs to support local communities and individual landholders, predominantly smallholder farmers, to do what they want to do in terms of investing in their own enterprises that are restorative of their degraded land. And that, of course, we all know is the key to success, and also the reason why so many restoration programs implemented in the past have failed to produce the goods, because they didn't have a connection with the incentives, the culture, the livelihoods of local people. I think that's where we have to start and end to have really large-scale success.
Wow, there's a lot there to kind of riff from. So we'll stick with you, Dennis. And I remember when I met you, it was a few years ago now, feels like a lot longer. It was towards the end of 2019, and we were at the UN launching the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So ecosystem restoration isn't exactly a niche topic. However, it's not on most people's lips right now. And what I'm hearing you say, which is kind of an interesting way to kind of see where we, those of us in this space are, is kind of, on the one hand, focusing very, very much with people in communities, people doing the work on the ground, but in the context of corporations, governments talking about carbon credits and translating carbon, something that's very abstract and kind of, embedded in the global economy, is, like carbon credits, kind of making that coherent for in terms of the work that needs to be done. That kind of middle space is quite challenging. So yeah, so from that kind of, from where we are situated here, how are you in the Global Evergreening Alliance meeting the challenge of working with the diversity of landscapes? You've talked about many different countries, the diversity of landscapes, cultures, projects, and languages, including different languages and different interpretations and different worldviews that articulate ecological phenomena.
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I think the way in which we can succeed and are succeeding in this area is through our member organizations who themselves have been working in thousands of communities across the tropical world for decades. Take, for example, one of our members, World Vision, which itself has an annual budget of around $2 billion, has about 25,000 staff that is on the ground in area development programs all over the tropics, hundreds and hundreds of them all over Africa, for example. And these people, these staff, have been working with these communities for a long, long time. You cannot just walk into communities ignorantly and begin to develop these programs without a long gestation period and the objectives of people and communities in rural areas. And so where I was fascinated by the scale of so many of our members working in so many places around the world, which we could build on the successes that have already occurred. So one of our principles is supporting those programs or projects among our members that have already been successful. So they've already proven themselves in terms of their confluence of objectives with local communities, and then building on that to scale up, to accelerate the spreading outwards of the adoption of practices that farmers have successfully adopted previously. And since we focus on the most cost-effective and simple and scalable practices, like I mentioned, assisted natural regeneration, farmer-managed natural regeneration, et cetera, the scalability of these is then practical. But the real focus, the real success is working with organizations that have already been fully immersed and have been successful on the ground in their work with communities previously. And that carries us through to the expansion of these opportunities.
Okay, thank you. So it seems like I was about to use the word formula, but the word formula is actually kind of antithetical to what we're talking about. But what, you know, what, so the network empowers the members of the network, given their relationships with local people, and that network member empowers communities. That's just, yeah, what I'm hearing you saying. So
Yeah.
Emmanuel, how would you address that challenge of working with the diversity of landscapes, projects, cultures, and languages?
Yes, sorry, I forgot to unmute. So, well, I mean, a lot has been said by Dennis already. I mean, I want to send kudos for all the things he was saying. So I guess we are totally in agreement on that. I think we were probably more focused on the how than the what, because I think we're aligned. So what we do is, yeah, so I mentioned we use a participatory approach, you know, that means that indeed it's very adapted to context. Now, how do we make sure that, you know, there is cross-learning happening from all this diversity of approaches and landscapes that we have, because we work in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Cameroon, in Indonesia, in DRC, on community forests, I'm speaking here specifically. So what we have done is that we really realized that works well. You know, we have teams on the ground that are totally immersed with the culture and, you know, have no problem working locally with the communities. But how do we make sure we don't reinvent the wheel? How do we make sure we learn from each other? So we have now, since a couple of years, like a lot of people started to look at things from the landscape approach, trying to look at several commodities in one area and several actors in one area, be it companies and other players. And then we have participated in launching some initiative on learning from landscapes and doing cross-learning and trying to build tools. This is a 1,000 landscape for 1 billion people initiative with several partners. This is a platform that is rather new, and it's recently launched some tools and initial learnings, but it will grow as time goes, to really make sure that there is one place to find different approaches and different ideas, so that there can be cross learnings. One of the challenges we run mostly into is really to find finance that goes into this landscape approach. This is something rather new. Donors usually go project by project and not across commodities and actors. Also, we find it difficult to measure progress done at the landscape level. It's quite easy to say, in one restoration project worked well, improved forest management here worked well, but how do we measure the impact globally at the landscape? Is there no leakage? Is there not an unintended consequence? The indirect land use changed debate when you want to speak about carbon accounting. And so we also participated in an initiative called Landscale that tries to do that. It has a list of indicators to measure progress at the landscape level. And also it's been recently launched online, I think a month ago. So we hope that through these tools that we contribute to, we can have this cross-learning taking place. Thank you.
Thank you. I hear you say landscape approach, or a landscape approach. And it sounds intuitive. I think I know what that means. Can you articulate what the landscape approach is and how it differentiates between, how it's different from what has been done before? You said that there was it used to be, or it's conventionally project-based, but maybe there are more nuances to this approach.
Yeah, well, I'm sure my colleagues here can also give their views on that. But what from the Rainforest Alliance perspective, when we speak of landscape approach, is we speak first of a governance at the landscape level. This is what enables to do things, activities, which training, advocacy, development tools, fundraising, etc. At the landscape level is you need a landscape governance. And here we're not speaking of, well, we speak of a jurisdictional approach, meaning that you look at what is done at the government level, but often the tools are not in place in terms of governance to include communities, local communities. And as we have heard, and as we know, they are the ones that really can make the difference on the ground. So we've been working, where we work on landscape, and this is still in the pilot phase, I would say for many people, at least for us, we set up a landscape management board where they have representative of the different institutions, communities, associations, donors, etc., that build this decision mechanism to what to do, what are the priorities, make an assessment of where things are, what are the priorities, what needs to be done, and then support implementation of it. And that can be a different array of activities I just mentioned. I hope that clarifies.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's very rich to think about. And I could also see that there are challenges that within landscapes, there may be communities that have different histories and relationships. But I can also imagine that people living in these places would see the benefits of working on a landscape level as well. Thank you. So John, we'll turn it over to you and pose that same question about how to meet the challenges of working with the diversities of, well, diversity on all levels of landscapes, of projects, and culture and languages within an alliance.
Yes, thank you. And I think I'll also segue into question number 3, because time is tight and it's sort of a unifying principle. So first of all, I just want to say that I think that the work that Dennis and Emmanuel have done and the way they're doing it exemplifies the kind of thing that the Alliance wants to support and be a part of. I think the Alliance is born from a realization that, frankly, the scope of all of these efforts and the sophistication and the unification, whether they're focusing on grasslands or rainforests, is still not visible to the practitioners, let alone to the policymakers who are trying to think globally. So I have really nothing to add to the methodological and culturally sensitive perspectives that Emmanuel and Dennis have mentioned. And I will just illustrate one of the ways I think we are going to try to address some of these issues and move towards the potential value of mapping. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment and show you a prototype, which is meant to make a number of points. These are a few eco-restoration projects. If you took the ones in Dennis's community and Emmanuel's community, in the other communities that we're aware of, it would look as if the planet was covered with pins of this sort. But as you zoom in, and we don't have polygons yet, but we will, you're going to see that each of these spots is a very small patch of land in a very large and degraded environment. If the common thread among these various approaches were recognized, we would realize that collectively, each of these established pins shows, as Emmanuel says, that it works, and that it needs to work on a large part of the world's surface if that's going to happen. And we need to recognize that in a diversity of landscapes and in a diversity of cultures, we're going to need a diversity of techniques. Now, Dennis has done a remarkable job of pulling together some of the biggest players in the world. As far as I can tell, there is still an opportunity to try to bring together some of the smallest players in the world, but to do it in large numbers. And that's where this map has the ambition of including projects like the Nakivale refugee camp in Uganda, which we have helped connect to our community. And now Michael Pilarski, who's with us, and a number of other people are acting as remote consultants to a group of African refugees who are doing really wonderful work, but need support. And to tell you the truth, I think they are very, very excited and happy that they're no longer refugees relegated to a backwater, but they are seen as important and valued players in a global effort. So what we hope to do, and this is an introduction to the next session, is develop a map which will allow us to collect stories from all over the world, form alliances with organizations like Dennis's and Emmanuel's, and have all of these stories separable and filterable, but recognizable as a unified approach to saving this glorious planet, which you see right here, and finding yourself as a critical drop in the only bucket we have. We are also facilitating conversations among these groups, as in the case of Nakivale and the consultants we brought together, and hope to use this platform to bring people together. But it's evolving. In some ways, our belief and our hope is that by promoting conversations like this and eventually making it possible for all of us to doing this work, which will not only sequester carbon, but cool the planet quickly, because that's what healthy landscapes do, that we will be able to get more people doing it and get the policymakers who are frankly focusing on big businesses and carbon drawdown to realize that it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that biological zing. You can quote me on that. So that's sort of our answer to that question. And however, there's a lot of work to be done in actually building out a scalable vision of this sort and a scalable collaboration platform of this sort. That's actually going to be the topic of the next session that Katie, who's with us here, is going to deal with. But that's to set the stage to the way we're thinking about it and our effort to try to figure out how mycorrhizal fungi do for ecosystems, what we hope to do for the eco-restoration ecosystem, and as with the emerging science of fungi as connective tissue for healthy ecosystems, try to figure out how we can do that for the biosphere, which certainly needs more of our support and less of our extractive destruction.
Thank you. So let me pose this. Okay, so we got a sense of some of the potential that mapping and monitoring can do. In what ways are you able to draw on the wisdom of communities? Because that's, as we all know, many conservation, environmental, biodiversity programs have been very top down, and we've realized that not only does that not work, not only is that not just, but it also misses huge opportunities to learn about what works.
I'm not positive whether that you wanted me to answer that, but I will
Sure.
say that is a critical question. And I don't think I have a comprehensive answer, except to say that humans evolved to function in relatively small groups. I think partly because it's the technology that comes to our particular community, and partly because it's the only thing we really know how to do, arranging for people like us to talk to each other. And when I say like us, I don't mean the particular demographic which we represent more than we would like. I mean the global demographic of everybody who appreciates the importance of healthy land, healthy soils, healthy landscapes, and living things, to arrange for conversations among them and to make it easy for us to find strength in numbers and find strength in comparing notes. It's a simplistic answer, but this is what humans have done in developing whatever expertise or whatever dangerous powers they have. And we need to apply that basic algorithm of talking to other people, treating them as equals and as parts of a larger puzzle, and facilitating that. Where I come from, I use technology. The important part is going to be that it has to be technology in the service of getting your hands in the dirt.
Thank you. Emmanuel, how is your alliance able to draw on the wisdom of the communities that you work with?
All right. So I already mentioned, our approach, which is really field-based and participatory. So what we do is that we want not only to support the communities, but really, I even don't like the term, but empower them so that they take ownership of of everything that they do regarding forest and the environment. And so, for example, we have developed with IIED a monitoring and evaluation system that really matches our integrated community forest management approach, and that is done by the communities themselves. So they are the one evaluating their progress on the approach, on the different pillars that we defined, and so that they can define what are the next steps, and that they really have ownership on, and have discussion about, do they actually want to work on that where it didn't evolve too much, or is it something not important? And it is something that we have just launched, and the communities really like it. I mean, it's rather long process because you need to discuss with the people, but they find it very, very useful. And with the same approach in mind, we not on the forest yet, but at least on the farm level, we are developing a mechanism for the communities themselves to track with GIS and their phone deforestation. So we have done the polygons of all the farms we're working with, almost all the community forests we're working with. And the idea is that using this app, or even just a paper, to verify where, how the environment evolves, and how, the trees are still there if there's an issue, combined also potentially with satellite imagery that we can support in preventing deforestation. One of the issues we have more on the community forest side is really that, okay, to monitor deforestation is not too hard because it's very visible, be it on the ground or with satellite imagery, but it's really more difficult to measure forest degradation. And here we speak of restoration, and restoration is not only clear-cut land that you replant back or you have natural regeneration coming there that you support, but it's also forest that has been, death by 1,000 cut, as we say, like degraded by having over harvesting or trees being stolen or just bad forest management. And so there are still trees there. It's still a forest according to FAO. FAO is 1 tree every 10 meters or so, I think, like to get forest definition, which in the context of tropical forest, for example, is definitely not what we want to see. So this is called forest degradation, and there's a lot of debate around that now. How to measure this? How to consider when it's acceptable degradation linked to reasonable logging, or when is actually logging not a degradation but a restoration? For example, when there was a over harvesting and then actually you have improved forest management practices that actually restore the forest. So. And this is a very fine line, right? And it's very hard to measure. And this is where, at this stage, we go more into qualitative measures than really using tools, technical tools. But hopefully one day we'll be able to have technical tools to measure that too.
Excellent, thank you. So what I'm hearing is that you are engaging communities in knowledge gathering, both low tech and empowering them to employ technology. And also there's a lot of listening going on that, not in, a number of times you all talk about conversations. And I think it's important to recognize that part of the conversation is listening to communities. And because I think that the NGO community hasn't necessarily always done that sufficiently. So Dennis, how would you respond about how are you able to draw on the wisdom of local communities?
Well, Judy, I think that we've already talked about how working with communities starts with the community's own objectives and livelihoods and the incentives that they themselves have internally for improving their farming operations, their forestry, their common land for grazing, etc. So that's where it all starts, really, is understanding that, so that practices that are being spread, being extended, are practices that would improve on communities' ability to meet those objectives. One of the things that we're really struggling with in the whole restoration global approach, and I think John touched on this a bit, is that we have a plethora of discrete projects, and because organizations and donors, financiers work on a project mentality, but when we think of what we need to do in restoration, we clearly see that it's not just adding up all of these individual projects, it's how to meld them into restoration movements. And that is something that, we should spend some time thinking about during this conversation, because it is a bit of a different mindset. There's a mindset to accomplishing the targets of a given project in a given specific area of the planet, usually a fairly small area. And then how do you meld these together into something much more organic which is the nature of a movement, where you're drawing in the inspiration of many different parts of society to engage in restoration. And we've had a very interesting experience in actually coping with this in Kenya, where I'm located currently. And we saw that there were many enthusiastic organizations engaged in restoration. We have a government that is strongly supportive of the need for restoration because they realize fundamentally that the forest land in the country is extremely small and has been declining. The agricultural land has been degrading, and the main food crops, their production has been stagnant for well over a decade. And the grazing lands are overexploited and have been declining in their production, not only due to the soils, but also more frequent droughts. So you have all these ecosystems in the country that are under tremendous stress. And realizing this, the government of Kenya has put together a target for restoration of these ecosystems totaling 5.2 million hectares over the next decade as part of this decade for ecosystems restoration. And then we began through workshops and conferences to bring together the different segments of society, the private sector, the government institutions and agencies, the NGOs, the research organizations, to be able to put together a means of sharing. And this is what John was really emphasizing with the storyline and the maps of projects and programs. What we want to do is give a sense of how all of this adds up over large areas. And Kenya has many restoration projects going on, many organizations involved, many communities engaged. Kenya is the home of the Greenbelt movement, where thousands and thousands of women are involved in reforesting their farms and their local landscapes. And so we have now developed a means through a conference that we had last year of creating working groups on all the various aspects of restoration with, as I said, targets for each of them, and regular monthly meetings of all these different people from different walks of life and segments of the society to continue month by month to learn from each other and to monitor their progress on the restoration process. And I think it's a really interesting national experience of evolving a national movement which engages and includes all parts of society. And we're currently in the Alliance and working with World Agroforestry Center and others to see how this kind of model can be adapted to many other countries where you don't quite see that cohesion between government, private sector, and NGO communities to actually build across these sectors to creating a greater whole. So I think as we talk about movement buildings in this session, or movement building in this session, we probably ought to think about the national level, because that is where you can really get the cohesion going on a geographical area that is of considerable size. And I'm quite fascinated with that approach that has been developing here in Kenya, and how it builds on the successful projects, but it goes far beyond that to engage the citizenry in this process. And as we explore today how individuals can get involved in restoration, I think we'll want to turn our attention to how they can get engaged in this movement building process.
Thank you. Before I move on, I just want to call people's attention to that there's, that point that Emmanuel made, that that there are degrees of degradation that may not be easy to measure, that number of people have put in different suggestions and different ways that people are measuring the kind of the nuances of ecosystem health. So Dennis, I'm glad you mentioned the word movement, because I think that's kind of what we've been edging towards, and the need for a movement as opposed to individual projects and groups, and that's why there's so much potential in networks. So what engagement between and among networks would you like to see? What's on your wish list for next steps to create movements, to create a global eco-restoration movement?
Yes. Well, what's on my wish list is the fact that there are very few sources of finance for movement building. The model that is ingrained in donors and in private sector investment is project-based. It's all project-based, and as I say, scaling up from projects to a much larger area, that is something that does not capture financing. So we're really, so many people realize that we need to focus on supporting movement building, but it's a mindset change that cannot really succeed without the investment that's required to create the process of scaling through movement building. Every project tends to fall back to its own particular goals and targets in a particular area, and then faces the difficulty of short-term funding that does not enable the scaling to really develop. So we still face a great conundrum there within the Alliance, and I think across the entire restoration development globally, is that it's so ingrained that it works on a project basis, that the whole way in which the monitoring of progress is made and the outcomes are understood is almost antithetical to the concept of movement building itself. And so we struggle with how to build movements because there's no finance, there's no mindset, there's no mechanisms for doing this on a really considerable scale. So we're still struggling with that. But that's where the wish list, you mentioned the wish list. I think that's at the top of my wish list, is examples that can actually enable us to do that effectively. That's still a nut to be cracked.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, John. And what's on your wish list in terms of more engagements among networks to allow for movement?
Well, sure. I will endorse what Dennis just said. I will take it as an endorsement of the sort of global involvement, everyone approach that the Eco-Restoration Alliance is trying to develop. And in the interest of time, I'm going to say that the only other strategy I will offer for engaging this way and building the movement is building the network is, and I'll make 2 points. One is to say that we're already talking with Dennis about having the alliance be a part of his alliance, our alliance be part of his alliance, and his alliance being part of our alliance, so that we can work together and learn from each other. And Emmanuel, we're coming for you. I hope you will be willing to have a conversation with us, because I really admire your work, and I think we're all doing collectively important work that needs collective recognition. the second point I wanted to make in response to this is that while Dennis described this Kenyan movement towards greater national integration, he took the obvious and necessary approach of saying we might be able to replicate this with other nations. But I think part of the power of movements is that they are often built not through funding, but through this social contagion process, which typically piggybacks on emerging technologies. I'm thinking of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which led to the American Revolution. I'm thinking of the Ayatollah's cassette, Samizdat, which led to the Iranian Revolution. And I'm thinking about the internet. And so that sort of business of trying to network people together and perhaps to use the power of movements to do what nations and funders and governments have failed to do is potentially a complementary approach to getting those who ought to be leading to actually get behind what the masses will understand that they absolutely need.
Thank you. And Emmanuel, I will let you close us out here in this conversation. And I know that you've been writing in the chat, so I'd love to hear what you feel needs to be said, and also note what's on your wish list.
My wish list, wow, it would be quite long. No, I have been thinking, I mean, look, we want to scale up all these very good, successful approaches that we just mentioned. I mean, mostly it has been now donor-led and a little bit government-led in some countries. We need to find a way to engage more of the companies and the finance sectors in our networks. So we have been trying on our end, small scale for a start, building a Forest Allies, where we have companies that join not just as donors, but really as partners to help scale community forests by really not only leveraging funding from their end, but leveraging partnerships with other donors and with governments, and also trying to go beyond their supply chain. So I think a lot of this conversation about trying to go beyond supply chain, being forest positive, there's a lot of words for now and not a lot of action. So we've been trying to find a tool to bring them on board. I must say it's really hard. Everybody's still speaking about risk in supply chain and not really trying to go beyond. But I believe that the companies really have an interest in now, going at scale with restoration and sustainable forest management, because it's the environment that are going to source from in the future. And we know it's not just forest by forest, it's really now area by area. And we were speaking of bioecosystems, and even if landscapes are not always matching those, they definitely has that approach in mind. So we need to bring them on board in this journey, and that's not going to be easy, but at least we are trying on our scale. I got the message that we need to connect more, definitely. I mean, the Rainforest Alliance is already part of a lot of alliances. Definitely very happy to join more of them and see if we can support more and get supported also in the work we do. But the challenge I see is now really to find mechanism to challenge this funding to communities. And that's a second challenge is more an advocacy challenge, because it's not only about money, right? It's also about mindset approaches, enabling environment. And for now, we have, I think, a good messaging and a mutual understanding about how it's important to devolve rights to communities, but yet it's still not totally there in many countries. Sometimes the rights are there, but in practice, it's not really given because of the administrative burden or any other blockages. So I think there still needs to be a lot of joint advocacy together in networks, to make sure that communities have those rights. And I want to apologize, but I will have to run after the closing of this session because I mixed up my time change between Guatemala and Mexico, and I have my flight back. So I really apologize, but I love this conversation. Thank you a lot for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And I think I think we've got lots of kind of overlapping segues into the next conversation. So let's do it. So Patrick, I'll let you take over, and safe travels, Emmanuel.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much,
Bye-bye.
Emmanuel. Have a safe flight.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, great. I'm just going to hand it straight over to Katie, who's going to facilitate the second session. Everyone, I think in the chat said they're okay with kind of pushing this back 15 minutes. I'm actually the one person probably who will not be able to hang on beyond noon, but I will definitely catch the recording. So by all means, if there's, if the will of the audience is there, continue as long as you feel like you'd like to. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Katie.
Thank you. So our intent here is to have this be sort of a participatory session building upon what we discovered in the last hour or so. And so starting to dive a little bit more specifically into some of the practical challenges and opportunities related to monitoring and data collection, related to some of the social interoperability between groups that we started to get into, as well as some of the data and structural interoperability more broadly. And so while different points were being raised during that last session, I was actually taking some of those down and capturing them within a Miro, and I will drop a link to that into the space here in a moment. But because we have such a small group, it feels a little bit more social of us to maybe make this a little bit more conversational. And I still offer to take down some of the points that continue to arise within the Miro. And so I will sort of set us up in a moment with some of the points that were teased out and paste that link into the chat. But before setting that up more specifically, I want to invite John to add some additional framing.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And just point out that we are working to tie together several different layers, both within layer and between layer. Obviously, the layer that is going to save the planet is on the ground and in the sea, and I should add, in the atmosphere. And for proper solutions to propagate around the world, they're going to have to become shared. And so one problem we have is, how do you go from measurements and activities and reports on the ground to some kind of a shared informational layer that we can all draw conclusions from and share with each other? Many of us understand this, and yet, as this conversation points out, every time I attend one of these meetings, I've become aware of new people doing new things with new patterns of organization. So to make it happen, we need to align and coordinate within and between layers. And that means that we also have to figure out how groups of humans who have already cohered into little droplets can begin exchanging, or into little organisms, can begin interbreeding and exchanging DNA and evolving and developing some more collective power. I think the last session demonstrated that all of us understand this, and we're all struggling to figure out how you coordinate these various organizations. And for that matter, each of these organizations struggles to figure out how to coordinate activity within these organizations. So there's a huge opportunity that Caitlin is going to be able to help us understand and solve, to help groups coordinate themselves and coordinate with each other. All of that rests on a foundation, which, however, I have put at another higher level because it spans the globe, of the internet, the data sphere, and the zeitgeist, which is to say, somehow all of these groups are trying to develop a movement, as we said in the last session, and a shared understanding which can spread around the world, become the, not because we're grandiose, but because our understanding is that's the only thing that's going to suffice, become the dominant paradigm for understanding our place on a survivable planet. And if everything can happen at that level, almost everyone, almost everywhere restoring the ecosystems they can impact, we will save the future. And that means that the state of the planet, the great big envelope that contains us all, is going to get cooler, healthier, and more supportive of life. And that's going to mean a reversal of the current trajectory. Now, I think each of those layers is fairly distinct. And what is lacking, or at any rate, what certainly needs a great deal more development, is mechanisms for increasing effective action and coordination within each level and between levels, spanning levels, because ultimately we need to connect what works on the ground on a global scale to help preserve and improve the state of the planet. That's meant to be a framework within which we can talk about different technological solutions and different non-technological solutions that can stitch this all together. Because I guess my diagnosis is that because they're not all stitched together, and because the economic paradigm therefore has allowed disconnected commercial entities to engage in extractive practices that allow those entities to develop independent of the externalities and the costs for the planet as a whole, that the solution to disintegration is reintegration and regeneration. Back to you, Katie. That's meant to be a framework.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. So to bring us into the three main inquiries, I'm just going to restate those really quickly, and we're going to kind of take them one at a time, diving into each one for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll kind of get back up into solution and next steps space. And so first, we're going to ground into the question of social interoperability between groups and networks, which is really where the closing of that last session brought us. So what a wonderful segue. Then into some of the practical challenges of monitoring and data collection on the ground. And so how do we connect discrete projects with their capacities to better sort of monitor or gather some of this data, particularly when it comes to both inputs related to things like carbon offsets, as were mentioned in that last call, and other forms of nature-based assets, ecosystem services, other funding opportunities, but also to inform our broader kind of awareness of how we're working well together and sort of feeding into that global picture. And then as we feed into that global picture, what does sort of our third challenge that emerged was, how do we really work this data and structural interoperability between groups and networks and platforms, knowing that there are a number of existing tools, there are particular tools that might work better across some of even the social barriers that came up in that first part of the dialogue. And so I'm pasting a Miro link into the chat here. And I'm happy to scribe as sort of things come up here. And so we can just use this to reference and to frame, but I'll pop into a screen share now and bring us through this first inquiry around social interoperability. And so first, you'll see that I was kind of taking down during that first session some of the questions and ideas that emerged. So I'll bring us through those really briefly first, because they're a little bit small to see here. But some of the challenges to social interoperability that began to emerge were basic ones around language and different vocabulary and worldviews. On the incentive level, local incentives, ensuring there are local incentives in place to restore on the ground, such as supporting livelihoods. And with funding more broadly, how do we garner the corporate support, the investment support? And to that end, how do we connect finance with the landscape approach rather than these individual projects? And there were a lot of opportunities that came up there, though, during that discussion. So sharing practices between action groups to apply across bioregions, models of massive restoration on the ground in many countries, such as in the Sahelian region, as came up earlier, bringing together skills, knowledge, and resources, including financial, so kind of context for skill and knowledge sharing. Networking, having network members act kind of as representatives in direct relationship with local communities as a way of bridging between some of these networks and efforts on the ground. Examples that are already working of member organizations that are working with thousands of communities across the tropical worlds. World Vision was brought up as an example there. And then also kind of looking at our actual patterns for organizing. So how do we connect in relatively smaller groups? And allowing alliances potentially to join other alliances. And so with that frame, I wanted to first take a couple moments to invite any other challenges that we think it would be helpful to address. Not that we're going to solve them all today, but start to see it as this group, and we can take down some of those challenges together and then move into the opportunity space. So feel free to raise your hand and then offer any other challenges that you're seeing. And we're just going to take a couple moments to document those here.
Well, I'm adding something I'm calling turfism, zero-sum thinking among organizations that might see themselves as competing for funding, which is not false, but it's not healthy either.
I tried to add scaling on one of the blue Post-its without success, but.
Okay, thank you. We'll get that in there. And can you clarify specifically, are there any particular challenges to scaling that you're seeing?
I guess we need to build the movement, whatever that means, in terms of NGOs, governments, funders, to actually translate, to the work on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
We are a tiny percentage of what needs to be done. So that's I think the biggest obstacle for me is how do we scale?
Yeah. Any other challenges that we're experiencing that we don't think have been captured here? Yes, Patrick.
Yeah, rather than try to phrase this myself, I figured I'd just hand it off to you. It occurred to me, so I did a project in grad school where we were trying to practice this kind of community-based approach in a particular kind of lower income area of Pittsburgh, in partnership with an existing community that had a relationship with those communities. And what we found is that you can't just hop into those situations, and that trust isn't transferable. So when you have these networks, unfortunately, the trust is much more difficult to scale, if not impossible to scale. And so, being able to kind of maintain the integrity of that approach and those commitments while respecting the limitations of these kind of outsiders to just jump in and all of a sudden be able to leverage, I guess, that trust, those relationships. So just kind of recognizing that often you need, if we're partnering with the Rainforest Alliance, our work cannot just transfer right over to their area, kind of pushing back a little bit on the turfism area. There are these kind of natural impediments to moving in and out of those spaces if you haven't formed those relationships yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I put that one in there. We've heard that from a number of different groups over the last couple of days. So I think that's a very ripe and relevant one. All right.
Michael has his hand up.
Yes, I was trying to see whose square that was. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, I want to just raise the challenge of how do we identify and what local communities are creating themselves without outside funding? How do local communities create their own local incentives, their own group processes so that they do the needed work without outside funding? It's been often referred to here as that you need to be able to incentivize people to actually do the work. And usually that means, like, how do you get money from outside to offer them carrots for doing the work? And Dennis referred to this briefly, incentivizing better practices. So how do we localize the needed resources, labor, et cetera? A lot of restoration work just needs shovels, hand tools, labor, local resources. And how do we loosen up or create those conditions where the local communities say that we need to do this for our own livelihood? Here's what we'll do together without outside funding. And so I'd love to have a conversation with that with Dennis Garrity at some point. And I have some other, I'd like to say something else to the group before we part, but that's my challenge.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other challenges before we move into the opportunity space? Okay, so I see there's been at least one new opportunity added to the board. So would whoever added that one like to speak to it first?
Sure, that was just me trying to to think of a solution. Again, the issue of transference of trust is often when the outside party has had to establish that trust, but there are approaches, of course, that don't involve outside parties at all, and it just kind of transfers more organically through the communities. So that might be, just thinking. I think so many of us have gotten accustomed to thinking, yeah, the communities are doing the work, but there's an NGO kind of at play, like providing them the resources or support that they need. But I've heard some stories within the ERA, for instance, where, you just have a really good idea. Somebody, comes up with some kind of innovation in the restoration space, and that just spreads like wildfire without any kind of mediation. So, looking for solutions that don't require this kind of active, facilitation, someone taking that solution and promoting it to those communities, them just recognizing it, finding it on their own and implementing it on their own.
Thank you. I have a curiosity about how that could tie to this notion of kind of identifying practices that are already working on the ground in terms of local incentives, and what might it look like instead of sort of supplanting structures on a broad or sort of top-down scale. What might it look like to identify capacities that are already working on the ground and build those capacities of these sort of community liaisons or what have you as an interface for tapping into some of these broader organizing contexts that we're in? And what might it look like to kind of codify some of those training or upskilling processes for those representatives? Any other thoughts on opportunities?
Katie, your comment and others kind of stimulated me to think, to recall the really interesting model of land care, which first began in Australia and now has spread to quite a number of other countries around the world. And it's a very, very community-oriented process of community land care groups identifying their own restoration challenges and taking them up with their own resources. But well, 30 years or so of experience with land care suggests that two things often are really valuable in a successful local project, besides the factors of trust and identification of the challenges that are common to the people of the community. And that is, number one, having a facilitation. And in Australia, there's quite an industry of local facilitators that are trained to be able to bring out these opportunities. And second, often a very small amount of money, usually in land care projects in Australia, in our global land care organization, we look at about $500 for a project, because oftentimes there is some requirement for materials, whether it's seed or whatnot, to be able to do these programs. But being small amounts, it gets away from the problems of the top-down approach, which is often, financing infrastructure of quite considerable cost. And when you get into that, then you get quite heavy engagement from outside, because there's a lot of money concentrated on whatever is being done. And so the opportunities to do things in a simple way from a community approach often are most successful when you're dealing with small amounts of money and a bit of facilitation that enables people to come together on a consistent basis.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we have Philip.
So this is, the main heading is news stories, I think, and the subheadings are, the summary line is, we are demonstrating the power of working with nature to do earth repair. And number one under that is, I'm going to basically call, based on the natural step, the funnel, which is that current practices are leading us to, crashes. So basically, current models are increasingly failing. And number two under that is, I'm working with a number of people that are developing the new models that are economically much more profitable. So those are going to be attractors. In summary, with application of soil fertility amendments, we can increase the productivity of agricultural lands by a factor of 4 to 6 and increase the growth rates in forests by about 70%. So these are going to be part of the new stories that will pull people together and draw folks to joining these alliances to learn how to do it.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's on, I don't see it on the map here, but a big opportunity that our group believes is that the global changes that are needed are in the parochial best interests of the practitioners. If you cool your own neighborhood, your life improves, and maybe you get food and water from it as well. But if that's done on a large scale, it also solves the global problem. And that combination of self-interest and global interest is very potent, and understanding human and animal nature is likely to be one that, if it were understood, could recruit a lot of people to the cause because it's in their personal self-interest in the near term.
So to synthesize that, it sounds like that's sort of tying to that news stories frame, where if we can
Yes,
adequately convey that these global changes are indeed in the best interest of these groups, and maybe even provide some of the tools or contexts
Yeah.
to identify some of these local problems to then build up to that local scale.
yeah, I saw a headline yesterday somewhere in a LinkedIn post. It said something like, protect yourself against drought and heat waves. It's simple. It's not talking about global problems. It's saying, hey, got a headache, take some aspirin.
So I'm going to insert a specific sort of prompt here that maybe brings us a little bit in the direction of somewhere between an opportunity and a next step. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, John and Dennis. At the end of the last dialogue, there was this talk around how do we bring together two networks that already exist, that may or may not have some overlaps, that are already at a particular scale, but consist of these projects at a local context. And so that's kind of a real live use case that sort of plays at both of those levels, at the network level and at the trust level of those individual projects. And I'm curious to hear you for just a couple of minutes kind of walk through what you would identify potentially as some of the next steps of starting a dialogue around how that could practically happen.
Dennis's camera is off, so I will go first.
Good, good.
So, but he's still there. I pointed out, so that, just a case study. I pointed out to Dennis that the Eco Restoration Alliance was formed in part to compete for a $25 million carbon removal X Prize that will be delivered in 3 years. Our argument to the X Prize committee was that eco restoration is the best technology for drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. And by the way, to appreciate it, you need to focus less on carbon and more on eco restoration and the benefits of healthy ecosystems in addressing the real problem, which is not greenhouse gases, but heat and dysregulation and the crash of the biosphere that makes life habitable. $25 million is of interest to some of the groups that have joined the Alliance, and aggregating our collective contributions, especially Dennis's, who thinks that by 2050, he's going to have, what was that number? 12 billion hectares. So an interesting question is, what do you expect to have in 3 years? Because collectively, we might again be able to bend the ear of the X Prize committee and potentially win a prize. Now, we're not doing it for the money, although all of these groups have talked about how they need the money. The real point is that there do need to be concrete incentives for integrating organizations and getting everyone on the same map for a variety of purposes: A, movement building; B, competing for cash prizes, and you can name your own C's and D's, are, I think, good examples of simple beginning gestures. Hey, will you share your data with us? We'll share our data with you. That might begin stitching some of these things together. I have one other observation that I wanted to make. For a long time, I've been fascinated by a story Oliver North told during the Iran-Contra hearings. I know I'm showing my age here, but he described a scene in the Situation Room where you've got half a dozen people, and each of them are talking to each other, but they also have a phone next to their ear, and they're talking to their minions. Now, this happened to be a top-down hierarchy, but it doesn't have to be. I think what these various meetings that we're having right now in which each of us represents more than one person engaged in a particular approach, is that each of us in this meeting try to channel our respective organizations. And if we can figure out how to do that at scale, you could have a large number of small groups who are tied together in near real time and able to reach collective decisions through communication that is not a massive vote, but a sort of cascading conversations. I don't know if that was clear, but I feel like we're sort of groping towards communications models which can marry the trust building of small groups with the scale and power of large numbers of people.
That's very, very interesting and provocative, John. What on reflection attracts me to the collaboration between our alliances is indeed the fact that within the Evergreening Alliance, we're developing our monitoring and evaluation systems and our Global Restoration Monitor program around the activities of our community of organizations within the Alliance. But what grabs me is this this need to go far beyond the 71 members that we have to the entire global community, and to be able to knit those many groups together, as you were saying, and stories and storylines are a great way to do that, because they are a natural way of communicating ideas among people, among humans. And I think that the kind of platform that you're developing is one that would basically capture the stories of very small to very large organizations and collections of people in civil society, the efforts of individuals as well, to developing this mapped approach to the entire restoration universe of the world. And that's, of course, something that we definitely need in order to be able to accomplish the kind of goals we're talking about. The 20 billion ton goal that I mentioned earlier is not actually a goal that we could even conceive of accomplishing within the Alliance. All we can do within the Alliance is develop models that show the way under certain circumstances to be able to massively scale, but still it involves the development of these movements that we've been talking about that are organic, as you had mentioned earlier, or someone mentioned earlier. And that's the holy grail of our efforts in restoration. And the more we work towards assembling the entire universe of storylines and being able to make it accessible so that people can learn very conveniently about what works best under their local circumstances and under larger geographic areas, the faster we can make that happen. So that's the really attractive thing, I think, about working together, because our alliances would complement each other in that scope. And I think we'll start to really explore how the platform could be a means of actually putting all of that information together and complementing it with the ways in which communication can be developed. Because it's one thing to visit a website and to see interesting things that are going on. It's another thing to experience the the conversation with people who are engaged in those interesting activities all over the world or within your own local area. And that I think is what you're aspiring to do, that I think could be a great contribution to this whole universe of efforts that we need to develop in the coming years.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, what a wonderful segue into that next section. So I think that moves us along quite nicely. I'll just quickly synthesize some of the next steps that came up here. So one sort of cluster identified was around narrative. And so one narrative that emerged was tied to incentives around participating collectively in global challenges, such as the X Prize as a concrete incentive for bringing together organizations and networks. And then more externally, looking at how we can spark shared dialogue around focusing less, such as focusing less on carbon, more on eco-restoration, or the connection between individual or local and common global interests. And then to John's point, exploring comms and governance structures, perhaps that can represent many large groups through these smaller groups to allow us to make decisions at scale. Teased out from another earlier point, whether we can identify some models, perhaps borrowing from this model in Australia to train on the ground representatives as facilitators to connect some of these local practices to networks without losing trust. And then to these more recent points, developing infrastructures that allow us to collect and reflect stories from the ground at a global scale, building the capacity of organic movements to move along these common stories, as well as developing infrastructures to collect resources across projects, organizations, and barriers at scale to facilitate some of these communications. So you all have access to the link. Feel free to share any other ideas that this sparks in the stickies sort of asynchronously, but I'm going to move us along into this next topic, which are some of the actually, you know what? I had swapped the order because I thought it was going to segue more nicely into the on-the-ground challenges to monitoring and data collection, but we seem to be really in this sort of network interoperability space. And so I'm going to go back to the previous order and dive into next some of the data and structural interoperability challenges and opportunities between groups, networks, and platforms next. And so that's an area that we kind of almost started to touch on in the last session, but didn't quite get into. And so we have a bit of a fresh slate here, although I did take down as an opportunity through that last session, the example of land scale. And so there's a little resources. I'm just going to share screen again. Started dropping some resources into this area on the right. And so feel free to drop in any other resources you might identify, but it includes the diagram that John shared. And I see Patrick, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to try to throw in, you know, something to respond to, and then I'm going to have to run. But one of I've had conversations kind of along these lines with some other people who are working in this space. And one of the challenges, so I asked specifically kind of about this funding question, you know, what is it that's preventing you from working kind of well and even kind of pursuing this kind of network approach to some of the practical problems that you're engaged in? And a lot of them will say that when they're seeking funding, you know, it's not that the funders wouldn't be interested at all. It's just that there's such a large upfront investment in kind of getting ready the infrastructure that's needed to coordinate at that level, to work well with the other organizations. You have to, you know, rework the entire infrastructure because we're not operating that way currently. And so it's not easily transferable to these larger scales. So really just thinking about what are kind of maybe the low-hanging fruit there for things that we can adopt. You know, I've worked a little bit in kind of open science, and people talk a lot about just kind of adoption of like fair data practices, like fair data principles and kind of data management. So something as simple as that, it doesn't require any kind of reworking of infrastructure, but still kind of moves you one step towards being able to coordinate more effectively together. I think that in order to incentivize funders, particularly these really large funders, to give money to entire networks or movements, that infrastructure almost has to be in place already. I don't think it's something that we can say, give us the money and then we'll build it and then we'll work well together. We really have to start kind of, I titled this session, in fact, kind of this interoperability by design. So really thinking one step ahead, even when we're coming up with an organizational structure and infrastructure for our own networks, thinking about what decisions can we make even now that will set us up to work well together with other alliances when those opportunities arise. So that's kind of, I guess, what I would like to see come out of this conversation is really some concrete, steps that we could take that would begin to move us in that direction and start thinking about, preparing for those opportunities. And with that, I'm gonna have to drop off, but it's been great hearing all of your feedback, and I look forward to catching whatever I missed in the recording.
Wonderful. Thanks, Patrick. And then Michael, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Hi. So I just want to make I guess this is a concrete proposal, but most of you on this call know that I am calling for a Global Earth Repair Summit in October to bring together representatives of all the alliances that we can get and all the grassroots people that we can get to come together for a 4-day program, partly in person and mostly online. And we're doing this to help build the restoration movement. How can our summit help build the global movement, which does exist, but is not prominent enough to itself or to the world? So at any rate, I definitely want to engage Dennis McGarity if possible. Most of you, the rest of you already know what I'm up to, but I encourage people to participate in our Global Earth Repair Summit to help do this movement building. And Caitlin, I'd love to have your feedback and anyone else's on how do we make the most of this particular opportunity that we're providing. And I'm hopefully going to be seeing Jamaica in just a couple of days to talk about this in person.
Okay.
So best wishes to you all. I'm glad to be here to hear this conversation. So that's it for me for now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And so I'll add back to kind of that social interoperability piece, perhaps, creating some of these contexts for that shared dialogue. And I would surmise that adopting some of these practices, like what John had mentioned around having the ability to represent some of these groups sort of across group and contexts like that one could be a really tangible step.
Rob has her hand up and I'm adding a few steps.
Yes, Rob.
That was a very interesting conversation so far. The one thing that I was thinking all the time, John, you said that, and somebody else also said that we are used to work in very small groups originally. And I thought of the hunter-gatherer time that we all had such fun. And I suddenly realized that the other aspect of that time was that we were having a lot of parties after hunting, and also parties after a harvest. And there's a sort of a rapid deployment element in that. And actually, all the people that I come across in this movement, I'd love to work with them. And probably for a week, we would all love each other. And then slowly we would start loving each other less. Now, what I'm saying is that maybe we can also put in a sort of a dynamic of fun, fast restoration efforts like the barn building that has been done in the United States in the old times, so that we could all come in, have a party, and then after 3 weeks, we probably all have a hangover, but we leave and the thing is done. So I'd like that as a separate dynamic to make it. A lot of what I hear is always very complex and takes a long time. And okay, so that's basically my rant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great idea.
Yeah. So
I just added, and now I can't see them, but adoption of shared agreements, e.g. on data and story sharing, which is to say there's going to have to be some contract-like agreement. And then there's going to have to be agreements on processes and formats and standards for those shared data and stories.
absolutely.
And I suspect that on top of that, lots of people will build lots of fancy rendering engines, and I don't know whether those need to be agreed upon. If the underlying data are open, shared, and in a common format, then everybody else will go to town. All those geeks who, who frankly are just waiting in the wings will have a lot to work with. And some of my best friends are geeks, Caitlin.
Yeah. I was smiling a bit too big from that one. I gave myself away. So just a process note, it seems since we have only about 13 minutes left and we had so much happening in terms of our sort of geek to practitioner ratio skewed a little bit in the practitioner direction in this conversation. So we spent a lot of time on the social and practical interoperabilities, which I think is appropriate for the group. I think rather than rabbit holing specifically into the data and monitoring questions, it might make sense over the remaining time to just sort of open up the dialogue across these contexts and continue kind of raising, rather than kind of rabbit holing specifically into monitoring and data collection challenges or some of the other data interoperability questions, just sort of inviting any other contributions, and we can just framework them into these existing categories on here. And so just inviting us to kind of, we've already organically kind of brought into the discussion. And so just naming that and allowing permission for that as we take our remaining time to maybe move into some additional next steps.
I have a feeling you have a few in mind. I encourage Katie to go first.
Sure. So I'll build first off of kind of what Patrick had named around providing some of the context that allow resources to flow across these different contexts. And so that's where I think there's a few different levels of next steps for interoperability that can be offered there. One of them is legal and governance interoperability. And so there are some novel structures, I believe, emerging that can allow for funds to flow more freely across multiple projects, whether it is multiple organizations or initiatives collaborating on a specific fiscally sponsored project, whether it is leveraging kind of steward legal frameworks where we have sort of a shared 501c3 that then has a bunch of kind of subsidiaries that allows for funds to flow more freely into or across those projects. Or an even easier one is leveraging structures like donor advised funds that then allow for those who are giving to projects to do so across a whole basket of efforts without those efforts needing to have that formal linkage on the other side. And so that's one piece that I kind of propose are some of these frameworks that almost, I've been calling it kind of a virtualized community foundation. If we can organize ourselves in such a way that when we then do approach funders for these ecosystem funding approaches, we have the right just kind of structural rails in place that allow for these funds to flow kind of to the right projects at the right time. And then from a decision making and narrative standpoint there, I think that kind of gets into then again having the right structures for not just collecting data or story in a consistent fashion so that it can be aggregated at the right levels, but beginning to align on some of those scales of aggregation. And so, for example, if we do, have these multiple networks that all have the means to be sharing their current stories, their needs, some of their successes, their data, and then we simply, without even the projects needing to know or really participate in that active aggregation, so long as we're structurally allowing for that data to aggregate up to different levels, then we can start to approach funders, as an example, who are interested in particular bioregions or particular categories of impact and say, okay, well, we have your impact and it's diversified across this whole basket of projects. How wonderful is that? We just de-risked it for you. And so that's an approach that I've been quite interested in and that I think we naturally stand to be able to do in some of the ways we've already begun organizing with one another. And all we need to do is kind of continue to create those scales of aggregation. And then the last piece I'll speak to is that there was a point that came up earlier around creating some of these contexts for shared communications as well around these projects. As we collaborate together or work on our individual approaches so that we can allow some of these contexts for the pollination of best practices and so forth. And I'll just say that that's what I work on every day. And so if anyone has any further ideas around that, feel free to reach out. But note that we're happy to continue setting up play spaces in the platform that we've been working on, Open Impact, to continue to model some of that. Our aim is to just kind of have a participatory roadmap that invites practitioners to kind of directly inform the trajectory of how we can best kind of interface with the projects on the ground to allow for this coordination of data collection and best practice sharing, but then also have us kind of help with that job of then aggregating it at the right scale to communicate it to folks like funders so that the projects can focus on doing the work and then others can focus on kind of funneling the resources to those projects. Just checking that chat. Rob, is your hand still up from previously or have you raised your hand?
I did it again.
Perfect. Wow.
Yeah, when we talked a lot about the problem of money not reaching fast enough to the places where it needs to be, and there was another remark from Dennis that I think it was Dennis about very small money quite often needed to trigger something, and then John put something in the chat regarding some that was only in the San Francisco area. I just saw that they were giving grants out pretty small, $1,000, $2,000 within 30 days, and then go ahead and send us a postcard. And I have a feeling that, especially with that last one, we could actually talk to them and see what their success rate is. Because if we could actually do micro financing sort of, somebody asks, they get, we interview them for about half an hour to an hour. And then we say, well, this girl or guy, they understand what they're doing. We trust them. We give them the things that they ask for a small amount. And then they have to report back to us and then they can get more. Then we can accelerate the funding at a micro level based on trust and a little bit of checkup a little later. So I think that dynamic would be nice to have in the way we scale projects, and especially micro projects, because we're not going to be saved by large, enormous projects. We're going to be saved by billions of small projects. Thank you.
You know, to build on that, I just want to remark that it's early days for the for the Alliance, but I think we did very well by welcoming Marius Ziganari from Nakavali to join our group. But he had terrible internet connectivity. And when that became clear, we were able to get him $700. And he's now an active member, and he's expanding his operation because he's getting support from people all over the world. And he, by the way, he got a workspace and a meeting space for 6 months with that $700. It may be helpful to think about those replicable small investments that can have potentially big impacts. And obviously the synergies with all of our grander ambitions are remarkable too. But it could be that if, for example, you were able to make it clear that people who are engaged in these efforts but relatively isolated could get, not the thousands of dollars they need to redo their entire landscape, but the hundreds of dollars they need to join the network that might help them get $1,000. That might be an attractive small funding proposition that we could help package and then disseminate to these organizations that we've just discovered, or to individuals within the group. Marius's $700 came from one person, but one person who was inspired by the opportunity because he'd been sensitized to the potential. And I'm being coy. That one person was me, but I feel very good about it.
I'll punctuate that by sharing that something that we've already started to just organically identify some successes from has been an organizing pattern that on sort of the group or forum level, however you want to frame that, invites not just practitioners to the table, but actually curates discussions that have practitioners, policymakers, and funders within the same dialogues as we organize around kind of best practices on the ground. And that seems to be filling the desires of funders who are kind of sick of being out of the transparency and want to have access to some of these dialogues. It helps disrupt some of those power dynamics that oftentimes have kind of the funders lording over floating above everything else.
Yeah.
All the practitioners are having these conversations. And so inviting that as a social pattern as we populate some of these networks or events. And I've seen some organic funding start to flow just from having those social containers set up in that way. And then to that end too, I'm seeing an increasing desire from funders to have guidance around some of those smaller projects that they can kind of put trust into, like Rob, the idea that you mentioned, and in particular, this exasperation around actually applying the right forms of funding to the right projects in the right sequence. And so I think one social tactic we can start to take is having some among us directly actually start to create the pathways to sit with these funders and advise them, and then have the right organizing and governance among ourselves so that when those questions emerge around, well, I have all of this backlog of money and I'm not sure where to apply it, that we can direct it really wisely to some of those key leverage points like the ones that you mentioned, John. We're almost at time. Any other burning ideas around next steps? And then I can close this out with a frame.
I guess the critical next step is the one that says, are we going to just let these sit in space, or are we going to get together and try to push them forward? Obviously, I think that we have got something that the present company can make forward progress on, but not in the 0 minutes that remain to this meeting. Katie, how do you think we should try to keep this moving?
Yeah, so I think that it would be great to make sure we capture the email addresses of everyone who is in this conversation, although I think we collectively probably have most of those, just for good practice. If you want to each drop your email address into the chat right now, And then I can send around an email that includes the link to this Miro, and that we can use to coordinate a subsequent conversation for all who might be interested. We can maybe put together a doodle poll for the scheduling, to have another just slightly deeper actionable conversation and continuation of this one. And during that conversation, we can also maybe identify others that ought to be in this dialogue and see where it goes. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
I agree. I think that sounds like a great suggestion on how to keep this dialogue developing. And while I have the floor, I want to give a vote of thanks to Caitlin, who I think has done a fantastic job in directing a discussion about a very difficult and challenging subject, and producing a great deal of insights that have been captured in the Miro board, and getting us thinking about how we can now work together to apply these ideas. So I think we could all put our hands together to Caitlin, because I just am amazed at her capability to organize us in such a way that we produced something tangible from these conversations. Congratulations, Caitlin.
Thank you. Looking forward to doing that at scale.
Exactly.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I'll send a follow-up email with the link as promised, and looking forward to continuing and getting into some doing.
Thanks.
Oh, wonderful.
Wonderful.
Everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Katie.
Onwards. Onwards, everyone.
Thanks to be
Onward.
part of it.
Absolutely.